Coming up on LevinTV, a closer look at anti-Semitism as it rears its ugly head in our country, and how the New York Times has been complicit for the past century. That cartoon could have been in official Third Reich newspapers. It all starts now.
This is where freedom rings.
If you believe in America, if you believe in the Constitution empowers us. It's a new day. America's back. America's back, and America's going to get strong again. We're going to defend America, and we're going to defend our interests.
Liberty's voice, LevinTV.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is LevinTV on blazetv.com. You know, I wanted to circle back today and talk a little bit about what took place in California. The murder of a Jewish lady, the attempted murder of really an entire congregation of Jews. And I want you to hear from that rabbi, and we will play that shortly. I also want you to hear from the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, who is a brilliant man, happens to be a friend of mine as well, about his comments. And he specifically talks about, among other things, the New York Times and anti-Semitism. Now, folks, prior to my talking about the New York Times and its anti-Semitic past, particularly with respect to its coverage or lack thereof of the Holocaust, nobody was talking about it. Nobody on talk radio was talking about it. Nobody on television was talking about it. Public officials weren't talking about it. And I've been talking about it for years, and I've certainly been talking about it during the lead up to the release of my book on freedom of the press. And what you'll find when you get your copy, and I hope you'll pre-order your copy, is this entire chapter, chapter 6, and the title of the chapter is The New York Times Betrays Millions. Before we get into this, I want you to look at this cartoon. Go ahead and show it. See this cartoon? This was the New York Times International Edition. There you have the President of the United States with a yarmulke, and of course he's wearing sunglasses, so he's blind. And you see his dog. His dog is a dachshund, I guess, with the face, an attempted mocking of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, with a Jewish star. That cartoon could have been in official Third Reich newspapers during Hitler's reign. That's how outrageous this is. This is a throwback to the 1930s and 1940s, Hitler's Third Reich, the Holocaust. The New York Times International Edition. And by the way, there was another cartoon the same day that was outrageous too. This is pure poison. This is pure hate. The same newspaper who is constantly trashing the President of the United States, constantly spinning what he said in Charlottesville, Virginia, as anti-Semitic and racist. He's lined up with the Klan and so on. Look at this. This is evidence, hard evidence, right in front of your eyes of what the New York Times is. And you might say, well, that's one cartoon. It's not one cartoon. The New York Times has nearly a 100-year history of this. The New York Times has a real hate-on for the state of Israel. It has a real hate-on for the Prime Minister of Israel. And it has a real love fest with Hezbollah and Hamas and the other Palestinian organizations. And it is constant. And one of the things I do in my book, On Freedom of the Press, is I point this out. And I don't just create these ideas, I use scholars. There's been 3 excellent scholarly books written on the New York Times coverage of the Holocaust or lack thereof. And in each case, they've gone through the newspaper, they've gone through the articles, they've gone through the editorials covering the period of the Third Reich. Every one of these scholars who's written these books has come to the conclusion that the New York Times intentionally hid the news of the Holocaust in its back pages when it even talked about it, which was rare. Some of the scholars talk about the motivation of the ownership of the New York Times. Sulzberger, a German Jew. And what motivated him? And among the things that motivated him is he didn't want to be identified ethnically as a Jew. He didn't want it to affect his newspaper sales. He didn't want his newspaper to be viewed as the Jewish newspaper. He didn't want to defy the Roosevelt administration that also played down the Holocaust. And Roosevelt, the great progressive, the New York Times, the great progressive newspaper. And so when the so-called paper of record, all the news that's fit to print, decides not just to turn a blind eye toward what was going on, the annihilation of the European Jews, but to serve as propagandists, that is something I felt you needed to know about in some significant detail, because the New York Times today is still pointed to as a paper of high repute, as a paper of high professional standards, as a paper that is objective, even though we know it's not. That's the way they point. And it is the leading newspaper, the guide star, if you will, for the other newsrooms and journalists that are out there. It's in the New York Times. It's said to be the gold standard. And what I'm trying to portray and explain to you, it's no gold standard, none whatsoever. Even by 1945, frankly, even after beyond 1945, they had a reporter at the New York Times who still would not believe what Hitler had done. President Eisenhower, when he was General Eisenhower, opened up some of these camps and insisted that not only the American people, but that the world media come to these camps and take pictures and take video and write down what these journalists saw, what these cameramen saw, because he knew the day would come sometime in the future where people would dismiss it or wouldn't believe it. The New York Times made it virtually impossible for the American people to know what was taking place in the early parts of the Third Reich, in the early parts of the Holocaust, made it virtually impossible for even studious readers of the New York Times to know what was taking place. And well, here's the incredible fact. It was the second time the New York Times did this, second time. Many of you are unfamiliar with what Stalin did to the Ukrainians in 1932, 1933. He starved them to death. 10 million starved in about 12 to 18 months. He cut off the Ukraine. He cut off the rail service. He cut off the roads. He cut off all the airports. He cut off all communication with the Ukraine and starved them to death. Why? Because the Ukrainian peasants, the farmers, were very strong-willed people, independent people. They'd been that way for a very, very long time. And they would not give up their farms to the community as Stalin was going through and nationalizing all these farms and so forth. And the greatest breadbasket in Europe was considered the Ukraine. People couldn't even feed themselves anymore. There was cannibalism. There were people dying in the streets, starving to death in the streets, emaciated. There were some reporters who snuck into the Ukraine and saw what was taking place, mostly from the Guardian Manchurian the Manchester Guardian newspaper. A couple of reporters. And they reported what was taking place. It was mostly ignored by the world. But there was one reporter, a correspondent, who was the New York Times correspondent. His name was Walter Duranty. And he was the Moscow, Russia correspondent. He'd been there 12 years total. And he lied about what was taking place in the Ukraine. He was a Stalin apologist. And some people think he was on his payroll because he'd be driving around in these sedans. He had the best food made available to him. He stayed in fairly swanky places. You could only do that in Stalin's Moscow if Stalin wanted you to do that. And so he was a propagandist. And the management at the New York Times had reason to know that. But they still kept them there. And so if you read the New York Times during the genocide, the great starvation that was taking place in the Ukraine at the hands of Stalin, you wouldn't know what was going on. You'd think they had a bad season, they had a bad harvest, people were not in great shape, but still, they got along. And so that's what you got from the New York Times. So I want you to think about this. In the last 100 years, two of the greatest genocides humanity has ever faced, the New York Times covered up both of them. Effectively, that's what it did. Both of them. Millions and millions of people. That's why Chapter 7, I entitle it, The New York Times Betrays Millions. That's why it's very unlikely this book will wind up #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, even though it should be #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and which will be based on sales. But that's beside the point. The cartoon, the Ukrainians, the Jews. What I also point out in this book is the extent to which the New York Times trashes Israel. The missiles are being fired into the state of Israel today, a state that's been in existence for 71 years, give or take, a people that have been in existence for 3,500 to 4,000 years. When the missiles are fired into the civilian populations of Israel by Hamas, which is backed by the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran and Hezbollah, the New York Times and most of the media in this country turn on Israel. You see, it was one thing when the Jewish people didn't have a state. It was one thing when the Jewish people were mostly victims. But now that the Jewish people have a country and can fight back and have sophisticated weaponry and can defeat their enemies and can protect themselves, well, now the Jewish state of Israel is under attack by the mass media, the world media, not just the American media, and that includes the New York Times. It's very important to know this because we give so much credence to these media outlets. They look, we're for freedom of the press. Are you really? No, they're not. Unfreedom of the press. Now, I want to show you this rabbi. Keep in mind, this is from April 29. He already been shot in the hand and lost a finger. He already went through this horrific event where this racist, this anti-Semite goes into this synagogue and wants to kill as many Jews as he possibly can. The good Lord must have been watching his rifle jams. And you had several heroes there, including a 60-year-old woman who jumped in front of the rabbi and gave her life to save him. She was murdered on the spot. Her husband, a doctor, was giving mouth to mouth and didn't realize it was her. Imagine that. And then when he did, he obviously fainted. You had a vet there who turned and chased the killer. And of course, you had an off-duty Border Patrol agent who pulled out his weapon, chased him to his car, fired into the car 4 times. The coward called 911 because he wanted the police to save him, in effect, which is what happened. He didn't go down with the ship, this guy. He didn't have the courage to put the gun in his mouth and end it there either. He's a coward. That's what cowards do. They go into these soft targets. They go into these synagogues and churches, mosques and so forth, or these schoolrooms. But anti-Semitism is on the rise. It's on the rise worldwide. People in France are told not to wear your yarmulkes, not to wear your Jewish stars, not to wear your mezuzahs. Do not reveal who you are. And this is growing. It's in Germany, it's the same thing. Parts of our own country. You have in our own country the likes of 2, 3 really, congresswomen who are celebrated by the media. Ilhan Omar, there was a piece in the New York Times, same day as that Third Reich-like cartoon, defending her and accusing her critics of being anti-Muslim. You have Tlaib, the representative from Michigan. Her parents are Palestinian. They came into this country. She is a Jew hater. You have her. You have AOC, who comes to their defense, AOC. You even have the Democrat Party that is very tolerant of these people. Democrat Party, which could not in the House of Representatives even put together a resolution condemning Omar by name for the things that she had said publicly. They wouldn't do it. You have a Democrat Party that plays footsie with Al Sharpton. You have a Democrat Party that plays footsie with Farrakhan. And you have a Democrat Party that is increasingly hostile to the Prime Minister of Israel. Hey, look, you know, we like to talk about we don't want interference with our elections. Obama interfered with the Israeli election. He tried to take out Netanyahu. He failed. Obviously, the Israelis like their Prime Minister. He's been elected now 5 times. And come midsummer, he'll be the longest-serving Prime Minister in the history of Israel, even longer than Ben-Gurion. So it seems to me they obviously like him, but the Democrat Party does not. Keep something in mind. The President of the United States is trashed all the time, as I was saying, that this week, and part of last week, was Holocaust Remembrance Week. And the President of the United States gave a beautiful statement about the horrors of the Holocaust. And the media in this country promotes anti-Semitism. They have people on their programs, so-called experts and professors, radicals, who are constantly saying things that are really incredibly out of line. And yet they keep trying to portray the President of the United States as something he's not. As I said, he put out a beautiful statement. His daughter's Jewish. She's a convert to Orthodox Judaism. Son-in-law, obviously. He's got Jewish grandchildren. Look what he's done for the state of Israel. It's just, it's so appalling. And to hear this stuff from the New York Times, and by the way, you know what the Washington Post did during the Holocaust? Almost nothing. And back then it was owned by Jews as well. It's incredible. Liberalism first, Democrat Party first, that's the way it works, whatever your religion, apparently. All right, so let's take a listen to the rabbi, who was really quite incredible and articulate, Yisroel Goldstein, at his press conference a few days back. Go.
Yesterday was the last day of Passover. Passover, we celebrate our freedom, our independence from slavery. Yesterday was the day that we came together for memorial service for those from the past generations. After 33 years, we did not expect what happened here yesterday. I was preparing for my sermon. I walked out of the sanctuary and I walked into the lobby and I met my dear friend, Lori Kay, of blessed memory. She came here because her mother recently passed away, and she wanted to honor her mother at the memorial service. She invited her daughter Hannah to come and sit with her, her only daughter. For those of us who know Lori, know that she is a person of unconditional love. I have known her for close to 25 years. She was a pioneer member from our congregation. She was one that went out of her way to always be there for those in need. When one of our members' wives was diagnosed with breast cancer, she took it upon herself to drive her to every single doctor's appointment, to be there for the children. Lori had unconditional love for all. She was the most kindest, generous, great philanthropist, and a great loyal friend, which you don't find much these days. I walk 2-3 footsteps when I hear a loud bang. I thought Lori may have fell, or the table tipped over in the lobby right here. I turn around and I see a sight that undescribable. Here is a young man standing with a rifle, pointing right at me. And I look at him. He had sunglasses on. I couldn't see his eyes. I couldn't see his soul. I froze. My first concern was, what's with Lori? Where did that noise come from? What's happened to Lori? And as soon as I did that, I took a look, and more shots came running right at me. And I lifted up my hands. I lost my index finger on this hand after 4 hours of surgery yesterday. They're trying to save the index finger on the left hand. I turned around and I saw the children that were playing in the banquet hall. I ran to gather them together. My granddaughter, 4.5 years old, sees her grandpa with a bleeding hand And she sees me screaming and shouting, "Get out, get out." She didn't deserve to see her grandfather like this. I ushered all the children out. Miraculously, just miraculously, the gun jammed. And in attendance at the synagogue, there was a Border Patrol off-duty agent, Mr. Jonathan Morales, who recently discovered his Jewish roots. He would travel 3.5 hours from El Centro to pray with us at our shul, at our temple. He felt great camaraderie here. He felt this is his house of worship. And many of times I would say, "Jonathan, you work for the Border Patrol. Please arm yourself when you are here. We never know when we'll need it." As soon as the gun jammed and as soon as the shouting was going on, he jumped up in pursuit. Oscar Stewart, a former soldier, jumped into action. He tried to tackle down the gunman. The gunman just exited and ran away, got into his car. This is all I understand from hearsay. I didn't see it. And Jonathan pursued him and was able to discharge his weapon and got the car a few times. After the shooter left, this terrorist left, I turned around to assess the situation. And I walk into the lobby, and I see Lori laying on the floor unconscious. And her dear husband, Dr. Howard Kay, who's like a brother to me, is trying to resuscitate her. And he faints, and he's laying there on the floor next to his wife. And then the daughter Hannah comes out screaming, "Daddy and Mommy, what's going on?" This is the most heart-wrenching sight I could have seen. As I was in my house, I received a personal phone call from our President Donald Trump. I was amazed to answer the phone and say the Secretary of the White House is calling. And he spent close to 10-15 minutes with me on the phone. It's the first time I've ever spoken to a President of the United States of America. He shared with me condolences on behalf of the United States of America. And we spoke about the moment of silence. And he spoke about his love of peace and Judaism and Israel. And he was just so comforting that I'm really grateful to our president for taking the time and making that effort to share with us his comfort and consolation.
There was nobody that expressed the horror and the beauty of what you represent better than you did. And I very much appreciate it, Rabbi. I know you're here with your son and your brother. I very much appreciate it. Please come up and say a few words.
We cannot control what others do, but we can control how we react. My dear Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, taught me the way we react to darkness is with light. It was that moment that I made a decision. No matter what happens to me, I'm going to save as many people as possible. I should have been dead by now, based on the rule of statistics. I was in the line of fire, bullets flying all the way. My fingers got blown off, but I did not stop. The Rebbe taught me, as a Jew, you are a soldier of God. You need to stand tall and stand fast and do whatever it takes to change the world. My life has changed forever, but it changed so I could make change. And I could help others learn how to be strong, how to be mighty and tall.
Mm-hmm. It's quite a man there. Brings tears to your eyes to listen to what those folks went through. His experience with the president is the same as my experience with the president. I don't mean any horror like this, but you know, when my father passed, the president sent me a note out of the blue. And When my mother passed, he called me and spoke to me for some period of time. I'm not sure how he knew. He's a very, very decent man. He really is. But you see that rabbi, and there was a little piece in there where he told the off-duty Border Patrol agent, when you come to the synagogue, come armed. And that would be my advice to all law-abiding people of faith. Unfortunately now, when you go to your place of worship, you need to be armed. Because now places of worship are so-called soft targets because they don't expect people to be armed. And I never thought we'd come to the day where somebody could go into a church or synagogue or mosque and just start blowing people away. But we're there, that's the day, and we got to deal with reality. The Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer, he gave a beautiful speech. Again, the week is the Holocaust Remembrance. And I'm not going to play the entire thing for you, but I want to play a little part of it for you. He is a brilliant man. He is a great statesman, too. So let's take a look at this. Go.
In recent years, we have also seen anti-Semitism increasingly poison minds in the political classes of what once proudly called itself the West. It has already poisoned a great party in Great Britain, and its noxious fumes have even penetrated this marble dome sanctuary of democracy. The Jew hatred of growing parts of the intellectual class is even worse. We have seen how the climate at universities has become more and more toxic for Jewish students, and how blatant discrimination against the world's only Jewish state has put a new face on the world's oldest hatred. We have also seen one of the world's most prestigious newspapers become a cesspool of hostility toward Israel that goes well beyond any legitimate criticism of a fellow imperfect democracy. The same New York Times that a century ago mostly hid from their readers the Holocaust of the Jewish people has today made its pages a safe space for those who hate the Jewish state. Through biased coverage, slanderous columns, and anti-Semitic cartoons, its editors shamefully choose, week after week, to cast the Jewish state as a force for evil.
Yep, he's got that right. And it's important that we all start speaking out about the media, about what the media are doing. The media are pushing hate. They're pushing division in this country. They're pushing the racism propaganda in this country. They give voice to it, they give face to it, they give cartoons to it. And that's why I feel, as somebody who's been involved in the Tea Party movement in a very significant way, somebody who was involved in the Reagan Revolution in a very significant way, somebody who has contributed almost a lifetime career to the conservative movement, somebody who now tries to defend a president against really rogue political efforts to remove him from office. I just felt now was the time to take our First Amendment back. Now is the time to use our free speech rights to get back our freedom of the press rights. And so I hope you'll join me in this effort. You can see how important it is. The media have an enormous force. They are an enormous force in this country. They have an enormous voice in this country. And so I thought today's program was very important. And that rabbi, his words, his face, his emotions will be with me for the rest of my life. That's it.